Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a place where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres guide you toward rest. Before tonight's story begins, you are warmly invited to share where you are listening from in the comments below. It is always a comfort to see this quiet community reaching across the world night by night. And if these stories bring you a sense of calm, you are welcome to subscribe and join us on these peaceful journeys. Now, take a moment to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Gently close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath and allow the day to soften and fade. Let my voice carry you quietly into sleep, to a place where imagination drifts and rest comes naturally. Somewhere inside Millbrook Hall, a drawer had been locked for 40 years. No one alive knew what was in it. No one alive even knew it existed. The woman who kept it secret had guarded it through 36 years of service, and she had taken the key with her into her grave that summer, or so everyone in the house believed. A new housekeeper was already on the road. She did not know about the drawer. She did not know about the letters folded inside it, or the pressed flower, or the small painted face of a young man who had been dead for 4 decades and remembered by exactly one person, until now. All she knew, watching the hedgerows rise on either side of a narrowing Derbyshire lane, was that she was about to take up a position held by the same woman for 36 unbroken years, in a house that had, by every account, never once stopped grieving her. What Eleanor Hartley did not yet understand was that the house was about to hand its oldest secret to her, piece by piece, whether she went looking for it or not. The carriage had left the last proper town behind an hour before, and since then the road had narrowed by degrees, the hedgerows climbing higher on either side until they met the sky in a long grey seam, and the horses had settled into the patient, unhurried pace of animals who knew the final stretch of a familiar journey. Eleanor Hartley sat with her hands folded in her lap and her small trunk wedged against the seat opposite, and she watched the Derbyshire countryside unfold past the window in shades of bracken and stone, the moorland rising away to the west in long bare shoulders, the fields nearer the road striped with the last of the autumn stubble, pale gold against the darker earth. It was the end of October, and the light had that particular low, amber quality it takes on in the last hour before dusk in that season, falling sideways across the land and catching in the hedges and turning the puddles in the road to bright coin-like flashes as the wheels passed through them. She had left London 3 days before. She had not been outside a city in something over 4 years, and the size of the sky here, unbroken by rooftops, unbroken by anything at all beyond the far hills, was a thing she found herself needing to look at directly, as if it required active attention rather than the passive awareness she gave to skies elsewhere. She was 27 years old, and she was arriving to take up a position she had not expected to hold for another decade at least, if she held it at any point in her life. The letter had reached her in September, forwarded through the registry office where she had been on the books since her last situation ended, and it had been brief and formal and had told her almost nothing beyond the essential facts. Millbrook Hall required a housekeeper. The previous housekeeper, a Mrs. Pruitt, had died in the summer after some 36 years in the post, and the family required someone experienced, discreet, and willing to begin at short notice. Eleanor had written back the same day. She had been an under-housekeeper at a smaller house in Hampshire for the better part of 3 years, competent and well-regarded, but young for such elevation and she had gone to the interview in London, with the land steward expecting to be gently informed that they required someone older. She had not been informed of any such thing. The steward, a Mr. Godwin, a spare and courteous man of perhaps 50, with ink-stained fingers and the manner of someone perpetually a little behind in his correspondence, had asked her a series of careful questions about linen inventories and preserving and the management of below-stairs disputes, had listened to her answers with an attention that felt genuine rather than procedural, and had offered her the position before she had quite finished her tea. She had accepted before she had quite finished thinking about it, and had spent the following weeks in a state of activity too full for much reflection, closing up her old situation, packing her trunk, arranging her travel, and it was only now, in the carriage, with the moorland going past the window and the light failing by degrees, that the full size of what she had agreed to began to settle into her properly. 36 years. The previous holder of the position she was about to take up had held it for 36 years, had run that house through the length of an entire working life, had known every room and every servant and every habit of the family who lived there in a way that Eleanor, arriving now with a trunk and a set of references and very little else, could not begin to approach. She was not nervous, exactly. She had never been much given to nerves, but she was aware of a kind of quiet gravity to the occasion that she had not expected to feel so strongly until she was actually in the carriage, actually on the road, actually watching the hedges rise and the sky widen and the particular quality of the light change as the afternoon moved toward evening. The gates of Millbrook Hall appeared without warning. The road, curving round a stand of old beeches and opening suddenly onto a pair of stone pillars, weathered and lichen-spotted, topped with carved finials worn nearly featureless by 2 centuries of Derbyshire weather. A gatekeeper's lodge stood just inside, small and dark-windowed, and beyond it the drive ran straight for perhaps half a mile through parkland scattered with oaks that had clearly stood there a very long time, their trunks thick and their branches spread wide and low in the manner of trees that had never had to compete for light. The carriage slowed as it turned in through the gates, and Eleanor leaned toward the window and looked ahead, and there, at the end of the long straight drive, rising out of a fold of the land with the last of the daylight catching along its western face, was the house. It was built of a pale grey stone that had gone silver gold where the light struck it directly and remained a cooler, bluer grey in shadow. 3 stories with a steep roofline broken by tall chimneys, mullioned windows set deep into walls thick enough to hold the winter out. A house that had clearly been added to across several generations without ever quite losing its coherence. An older wing to the east with narrower windows and a lower roofline. A more recent block to the west with the taller sash windows of a later century, the 2 joined by a central range with a porticoed entrance and a broad flight of stone steps. Ivy had been allowed to climb one corner of the eastern wing nearly to the roofline, dark green against the pale stone, and rooks were circling above the chimneys. In that particular unhurried evening pattern rooks keep, calling to each other in the cooling air. Eleanor sat forward and looked at it as the carriage covered the last stretch of drive, and she felt something in her chest do the quiet, involuntary thing a chest does when it encounters something larger and older and more settled into itself than anything it had been expecting. The carriage drew up not at the great front steps, which she understood without being told were not for her, but at a smaller door set into the side of the house, reached by a shorter flight of steps, worn into gentle hollows in their centers by long use. The servants' entrance, discreet and businesslike, with a boot scraper set into the stone beside it and a row of pegs, just visible through the half-open door for coats and hats. A woman was waiting there already, having evidently heard the carriage on the drive, standing with her hands folded at her waist in the stance of someone accustomed to waiting and to being the first face a new arrival saw. She was perhaps 50, broad and solid through the shoulders, with a plain, kind, weathered face and grey hair drawn back severely beneath a cap, and she came forward as the carriage door opened and offered Eleanor a hand down with a brisk, practical courtesy. "Miss Hartley, I'm Mrs. Doyle, the cook. Mr. Godwin sent word you'd be arriving this evening, and he asked me to see you settled, as he's away to the market town till tomorrow on the estate's business." Her voice had the flat, warm vowels of Derbyshire in it, and her handshake was firm and brief and entirely without ceremony. "You'll have had a long journey. Come in out of the cold, and we'll get you something hot before you do another thing." Eleanor thanked her and followed her in through the low door, ducking slightly beneath the lintel out of old habit, though she had ample clearance, and found herself in a stone-flagged passage that ran the width of that part of the house, dimly lit by a single oil lamp hung from a bracket, cool, with the particular coolness of old stone that has never fully warmed, even in high summer, and would certainly not warm now, in the last week of October, with the evening drawing in fast outside. The passage smelled of wood smoke and something baking, a warm, yeasted smell that reached her before they had gone 10 paces, and beneath it, fainter, something else, something dry and herbal that she could not immediately place, old and settled into the stone itself, the way certain smells become settled into a house that has held them a very long time. Mrs. Doyle led her along the passage and through a door into the kitchen, and the change in temperature and light was immediate and welcome. The great range along the far wall throwing out heat in visible waves, copper pots hung in orderly rows above it, catching the firelight in warm, coppery flashes, a long scrubbed table running the length of the room with a girl of perhaps 16 working at one end of it, flouring her hands for bread, who looked up briefly and ducked her head in a shy greeting before returning to her work. The kitchen was large, low-beamed, warm in every sense the passage had not been, and Eleanor felt the tiredness of the journey settle into her shoulders all at once, the particular tiredness that only becomes noticeable once warmth and the prospect of rest arrive to make it noticeable. "That's Peggy, the kitchen maid," Mrs. Doyle said, gesturing at the girl with a flowery motion of her own hand. "She'll be glad of another woman about the place who isn't me barking at her all day. Won't you, Peggy?" Peggy smiled without looking up again. "And Mrs.?" Doyle drew out a chair at the near end of the table and gestured Eleanor into it with the same brisk practicality she had shown at the door. "Sit yourself down. You'll want tea before anything. And there's a pie just come out that won't wait on ceremony." Eleanor sat, gratefully, and let the warmth of the kitchen work into her, while Mrs. Doyle moved about with the easy economy of someone who had run that kitchen a long time and did not need to think about where anything was kept. A cup of strong tea appeared in front of her, and a plate with a wedge of pie, the pastry golden and the filling dark with rabbit and root vegetables, and Eleanor ate with an appetite the day's travel had earned her, while Mrs. Doyle sat across from her with her own cup and studied her with the frank, unhurried curiosity of a woman assessing a new colleague she expected to be working alongside for some years. "You've come from Hampshire, Mr. Godwin tells me," Mrs. Doyle said. big house? Was it? Middling, Eleanor said. Nothing on this scale. I was under housekeeper there, not the housekeeper proper. This is my first house of my own, if you'll allow the expression. Well, you'll find your feet, Mrs. Doyle said, in the tone of someone who considered the matter more or less settled and saw no profit in dwelling on it further. It's a good house. Family's easy enough to please when they're here, which isn't often. They're at the London house through most of the season and don't come north till the shooting starts. And that's still some months off. So you'll have the run of the place to yourself a good while yet, to learn it properly before anyone's here to notice you learning it. She paused, and something in her face changed slightly, softened and grew more careful, the look of someone approaching a subject she had been asked to handle with a certain gentleness. You'll have heard about Mrs. Pruitt, only that she'd passed in the summer, after a great many years in the post, Eleanor said. Mr. Godwin didn't say a great deal more than that. No, he wouldn't. He's not a man for talking round things. He finds difficult, and her going was difficult for him, for all of us. Mrs. Doyle turned her cup slowly on its saucer. A small, unconscious gesture. 36 years she kept this house. I've been here 22 of them myself, under her the whole time, and I'll tell you plainly, Miss Hartley, there's not a room in this house that doesn't still feel like hers. And it'll be some while yet before that changes, if it changes at all. I don't say that to trouble you. I say it so you're not caught unawares by it, when you feel it yourself, which you will, likely, before the week's out. Eleanor set down her fork and considered this, turning the words over the way she turned over most things that were given to her plainly, and without embellishment, trusting there was something true and useful in them worth taking seriously. I don't think I'll mind that, she said after a moment. A house that remembers its people properly seems to me a better sort of house than one that doesn't. Mrs. Doyle looked at her for a moment with an expression Eleanor could not quite read, something between surprise and approval, and then nodded once, as if a small private question had been answered to her satisfaction. Aye, she said. Well, you'll do, I think. She rose and began clearing the table with brisk efficiency. You'll want to see your room and get your things settled before it's fully dark. I'll take you up myself, seeing as Mr. Godwin's not back to do the honors. They went up together, out of the kitchen and along another passage, this one running toward the older eastern part of the house, past a still-room door that stood ajar, past a linen room with its door closed, up a narrow Slusian staircase that turned twice on itself before emerging onto a corridor on the second floor. Low-ceilinged, the walls whitewashed and plain, a row of doors along one side each, marked with a small brass number. The corridor given over to the senior staff. Mrs. Doyle explained, the housekeeper's room being the largest and best situated, at the corridor's end, where a window looked out over the kitchen garden toward the darkening moor beyond. Mrs. Doyle stopped at the last door and produced a key from the ring at her waist. And there was a small pause before she turned it in the lock, a pause Eleanor noticed without fully understanding it until later, and then the door swung open onto a room that took Eleanor's breath slightly. Not for its grandeur, which was modest, a housekeeper's room being furnished for use rather than display, but for the immediate and powerful sense it gave of having very recently belonged to someone else. It was a good-sized room, square, with a single deep-set window, under which stood a writing desk, and a narrow bed against the far wall, with a patchwork quilt folded neatly at its foot, and a wardrobe, and a small fireplace laid ready but not lit, and a wing chair angled toward it that had clearly been sat in, for many years, by someone of a particular height and habit, its cushion worn into a shape that was not quite Eleanor's shape and would take some getting used to. On the desk stood an inkstand and a blotter and a small stack of ledgers tied with ribbon, and above the fireplace hung a small framed sampler, the stitching faded but still legible, a verse about diligence and the keeping of a well-run house, worked by a hand that had clearly practiced the craft a great many times before achieving this particular example of it. This was her room, then, Eleanor said quietly, and it was not quite a question. It was, Mrs. Doyle said. We've aired it and changed the linens, and I had Peggy give it a proper turning out, but I'll own I didn't touch the desk, nor the shelf there. She gestured toward a small shelf beside the fireplace, on which stood a row of glass jars, apothecary style, each with a paper label in careful copperplate, dried herbs and flowers visible through the glass in shades of grey-green and faded gold and dusty lavender blue. That's her still-room work, some of it. There's more downstairs, a great deal more. But she kept certain jars up here. The one she was using or the one she was fondest of. I never rightly knew which. I thought you'd want to decide yourself what's kept and what's cleared, seeing as it's your room now, and you're right to make it so. I didn't think it my place to choose for you. Eleanor crossed to the shelf and looked at the jars without touching them, reading the labels in the fading light from the window. Lavender, harvest year, noted beneath in smaller script. Rose petals, dried whole. Chamomile, something labeled simply for sleeping. No further explanation offered. The handwriting was small, upright, careful. The hand of someone who had written a great many labels over a great many years, and had long since stopped needing to think about the forming of the letters, the pen simply following a groove worn by long habit. I think, Eleanor said slowly, I should like to keep them, for now at least, until I understand a little better what they were for, and whether I've any use for them myself. She turned from the shelf and looked round the room again, at the worn cushion of the wing chair, at the ledgers tied with ribbon, at the sampler above the cold fireplace, and felt again that quiet, involuntary settling in her chest, the sense of a room that had been thoroughly lived in and was not, whatever the legal or practical facts of the matter, quite finished being hers. Well, Mrs. Doyle said, in the tone of someone drawing a comfortable conclusion, I'll leave you to get your things unpacked, and I'll send Peggy up with hot water directly, and a fire lit, it being cold enough tonight for one even this early in the season. Breakfast is at 6:30 below stairs, and Mr. Godwin will be back by morning, and no doubt want to see you and go over the keys and the accounts properly. Sleep well, Miss Hartley, and welcome to Millbrook. She went out and drew the door to behind her, and Eleanor stood alone in the room for a long moment, listening to Mrs. Doyle's footsteps recede down the corridor and the stair, and then to the particular quality of silence that settled in their absence. A silence with a kind of weight and shape to it, the silence of an old house at the end of an October day, holding the last of its light in the deep window, and beginning, room by room, floor by floor, to give itself over to the dark. She unpacked slowly, hanging her few dresses in the wardrobe, which smelled faintly of cedar, and, beneath that, of something floral and dry that she suspected came from a sachet tucked somewhere among the shelves. Arranging her small collection of books on the corner of the desk beside the tied ledgers, setting out her hairbrush and her few toiletries on the washstand, Peggy came up as promised with a jug of hot water and knelt to lay and light the fire, working with the quick, economical movements of a girl well used to the task. And within a quarter hour, the room had begun to warm, and the firelight had begun to move across the walls and pick out the gilt edges of the framed sampler, and throw long, soft shadows from the wing chair across the floorboards. Eleanor sat at the desk once Peggy had gone, and after a moment's hesitation untied the ribbon on the topmost ledger and opened it, not from any particular sense that she was owed the privilege, but from a housekeeper's practical understanding that these were now, in some sense, her responsibility, records she would need to understand in order to do her work properly. The ledger was a household accounts book, columns of neat figures in the same small upright hand as the jar labels. Linen purchased, coal ordered, wages recorded, the ordinary bones of a house's daily running laid out across page after careful page, going back. She saw as she turned back through it, a full decade at least, this being only the most recent of what must have been a long series of such books. She turned forward again to the last completed pages, near the ledger's end, and found the entries stopping abruptly in June, mid-page, mid-month, the final entry, a note of linen sent to the laundress. The handwriting, she thought, perhaps very slightly less steady than the entries above it, though she could not be certain whether she was imagining that unsteadiness now, knowing what she knew, or whether it had genuinely been there. Below the final entry, the rest of the page was blank, and the pages after it, blank also, waiting, she supposed, for her own hand to begin filling them, though she found she was not yet ready to pick up a pen and do so, not on her first night in the house, not before she had learned anything at all of the rhythms and needs the numbers in this book were meant to serve. She closed the ledger and retied the ribbon and set it back precisely where it had been, and sat for a while longer in the wing chair, which held her a little differently than she was used to being held, the cushion shaped by another woman's years of sitting in exactly that spot, at exactly that angle to the fire, and she found she did not mind the strangeness of it, found instead that there was something almost companionable in it, in sitting where someone else had sat so many hundred evenings, watching the same small fire in the same small grate, in the same quiet room at the end of the same quiet corridor, at the far eastern edge of a great house, settling into an October night. She went to bed early, worn through with the length of the day's travel, and lay for a while in the narrow bed, listening to the house around her, the small settling sounds an old building makes as it cools in the evening air, a distant door somewhere below, the wind beginning to move more definitely across the moor outside, and finding the edges of the window frame, and beneath all of it, so faint she could not have said with certainty it was there at all, rather than imagined, the dry, papery, herbal smell of the jars on the shelf, lavender and rose and chamomile, and the nameless thing labeled only for sleeping, settling through the darkened room, the way such smells settle into a house that has held them a very long time. And she slept, more soundly than she had expected to, on a first night in a strange bed in a strange house, and did not dream, or did not remember dreaming, and woke in the grey hour before dawn to the sound of a house beginning, somewhere below her, to stir. Mr. Godwin returned before breakfast was cleared, as Mrs. Doyle had promised, and sent word up that he would see Miss Hartley in the steward's room at 9 o'clock. And Eleanor spent the intervening hour walking a first tentative circuit of the below-stairs passages on her own, orienting herself as best she could, the kitchen with its great range, and Mrs. Doyle already deep in the morning's baking, the scullery beyond it, cold and stone-flagged and smelling of lye soap, a servants' hall with a long table and a row of bells along one wall, each labelled for a different room above. Silent now, but presumably given to a considerable clamour when the family was in residence. And the still room, its door standing open this time in the grey morning light, and Eleanor stopped in the doorway and looked in without yet entering, and felt, standing there, the first proper intimation of what the coming weeks and months of learning this house were going to require of her, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was looking forward to the requiring. The still room was narrow and long, running the depth of that wing of the house. A single window at the far end, letting in a cool northern light. Shelves along both walls from floor to head. Height crowded with jars and bottles and boxes. Dried herbs hung in bunches from hooks set into the beams overhead. A marble-topped work table running down the center of the room, scrubbed pale. A small copper still standing at one end of it. Unused now, its surface dulled with the particular soft dullness copper takes on when it has not been polished in some months. The smell in the room was extraordinary, layered and complex in a way the single faint traces upstairs had only hinted at. Dried lavender and rose, and something resinous underneath. Beeswax and old paper, and the sharp green note of herbs that had been hung to dry and had held their scent through the drying rather than losing it. The accumulated smell of 36 years of a single woman's careful, daily attention to this one narrow room. And Eleanor stood in the doorway and breathed it in and understood, without being able to fully articulate why, that this room was going to matter to her a great deal more than its modest size and unglamorous purpose would suggest to anyone who had not stood exactly where she was standing and breathed exactly what she was breathing. Mr. Godwin received her in the steward's room at 9 precisely, a small book-lined study off the main hall, and proved in person exactly as she remembered him from the interview in London, courteous and precise and a little abstracted. His desk covered in papers, arranged in an order that was presumably legible to him and to no one else. He went through the household accounts with her for the better part of an hour. The wages and the provisioning and the arrangements for the family's eventual arrival for the shooting season, and at the end of it he opened a drawer and produced a ring of keys, heavy, iron and brass, mixed, perhaps 30 keys in all, and set it on the desk between them with a small, careful ceremony that told Eleanor he understood exactly what he was handing over, and did not consider the moment a small one. These were Mrs. Pruitt's, he said. Every lock in the house, bar the family's own private rooms, which have their own keys kept separately, and will be shown you when the family arrives. I confess I have not had the heart to have them recut or relabeled since the summer. You'll find some of the labels in her hand, and I dare say a few of the locks have grown stiff with disuse these past months, nobody quite liking to use certain rooms in her absence. He paused, and something crossed his face, quick and private, gone before Eleanor could quite read it. She was a remarkable woman, Miss Hartley. I do not say that as mere courtesy to the dead. This house ran for 36 years, very largely because of her, in ways the family upstairs never fully appreciated and I doubt ever will, that being rather the nature of the work, I find done best when done invisibly. I hope you will not think it strange of me to say that I am glad, watching you these 2 days, to think the house is in careful hands again. It has felt, since June, a little as though it were holding its breath. Eleanor took up the keys, feeling their considerable weight settle into her palm, and found herself unexpectedly moved by the small speech, by the plainness and evident sincerity of it, and by the weight of the keys themselves, which seemed, in that moment, to carry a good deal more than their simple iron and brass would account for. "I'll do my best by it," she said, "and by her memory, such as I can honor it, not having known her. I think," Mr. Godwin said, "that you will find the house itself is not short of ways to introduce you to her memory, whether you go looking for them or not. She kept things very carefully, Miss Hartley. Her records, her still room, her small private habits. I would not be at all surprised if you found yourself coming to know her rather better over the coming months than either of us could tell you of her directly." He said it lightly, in the manner of a passing observation rather than a deliberate hint, and turned the conversation to more immediate practical matters: the ordering of coal for the winter, the state of the linen inventory, the date by which certain rooms upstairs would need opening and airing in anticipation of the family's eventual return, and Eleanor listened and made notes and asked the questions a careful housekeeper asks, and did not, in that moment, dwell further on his remark, though it returned to her more than once in the days that followed. In the still room, in the locked drawer of the writing desk in her own room, in the particular quality of certain silences in certain parts of the house. And she came, in time, to understand that he had not been speaking lightly at all, but had been trying, in his own careful and indirect way, to prepare her for something he did not have the words to name outright. The days that followed settled into a rhythm more quickly than Eleanor had expected. The particular grace of a house running below stairs on habits laid down long before her arrival, habits she had only to learn and step into rather than invent from nothing. She rose before 6, as she had always risen, and went down through the cold, dim corridors to the kitchen, where Mrs. Doyle was already at work, and took her tea standing at the corner of the great scrubbed table while the range came properly to heat, and Peggy laid the fires in the rooms that would need them, though with the family away that meant only the below-stairs rooms and a handful of the principal rooms kept minimally aired against the possibility of unexpected visitors. The steward's room, the small breakfast parlor, the library, which Mr. Godwin used most mornings for an hour before turning to estate business proper. She spent her first full week largely in inventory, going room by room through the house with the great ring of keys at her waist, learning which key fit which lock through the simple, patient method of trial, several of the locks proving stiff exactly as Mr. Godwin had warned her, requiring oil and a careful coaxing patience before they would turn, and she found, working her way methodically through the shut-up rooms of the west wing, dust sheets draped over furniture in pale, ghostly shapes, shutters closed against a season, with no one present to admire the view, that she was developing a quiet, private sense of the house's character, its particular cold spots and warm corners, the rooms that held the light well and the rooms that never seemed to, the long gallery on the first floor, with its row of family portraits, watching her progress down its length with the mild, indifferent attention of the long dead, the small chapel at the base of the east wing, disused now, but still kept swept, and the single stained window still kept clean. The library with its high shelves and its smell of leather and old paper, a smell she found she liked a great deal, close as it was in its way, to the smell of the still room, both rooms devoted, in their different fashions, to the careful, patient preservation of something valuable across long stretches of time. It was in her second week, on a grey, still Tuesday with rain threatening all morning and finally arriving in the early afternoon in a soft, steady fall that made the kitchen garden beyond the window a study in silver and green, that Eleanor returned properly to the still room, this time not merely to note its existence in her inventory, but to begin the slower work of actually understanding it, of learning what the shelves held and how they had been arranged, and what, if anything, of the room's daily use she might be expected to continue. She went alone, in the quiet hour, after the midday meal, when Mrs. Doyle was resting her feet by the kitchen fire and Peggy was occupied with the washing up, and she let herself in with the key already worn smooth on its ring from Mrs. Pruitt's own 36 years of daily use, and stood for a while, just inside the door, letting her eyes adjust to the cool northern light, letting the room's particular layered smell settle over her the way it had on her first morning, and then began, carefully, methodically, to work her way along the shelves. The jars were arranged, she came to see, with a logic that was not immediately obvious but revealed itself gradually as she moved along the shelves, reading label after label in that same small, careful, upright hand. Herbs for the kitchen on the lower shelves nearest the door, thyme and bay and marjoram in plain glass jars refilled. She guessed every season from the kitchen garden itself. Above them, herbs and flowers for the household's medicine chest, feverfew and comfrey, and something labeled simply for the chest, meaning, Eleanor supposed, complaints of the lungs. Higher still, and running the length of the room's far end, an entire section given over to what she could only think of as the domestic arts proper, lavender in several jars of differing harvest years, rose petals both whole and crushed, orris root, beeswax in a dozen small cakes wrapped in muslin. Ingredients, she understood, for the polishes and waters and sachets that a well-run great house required in quantities Eleanor had understood, in principle, but had never before seen assembled quite so thoroughly, quite so lovingly. In one narrow room, she found, tucked at the very end of the topmost shelf, half hidden behind a row of larger bottles, a smaller jar with no label at all, its glass slightly different from the others, older, perhaps, or simply from a different source, and inside it, dried flowers she did not immediately recognize, small and star-shaped and a faded violet blue, quite unlike anything else on the shelves around it. She took it down carefully and turned it in the grey light from the window, and found, on its underside, not a label exactly, but a mark, scratched directly into the glass, with something sharp, a single letter, an M, and beneath it, so small she had to bring the jar close to make it out at all, a date, some 4 decades past. She stood holding it for a long moment, turning the small mystery of it over in her mind, the way she had turned over Mrs. Doyle's words on her first evening, and Mr. Godwin's careful, unfinished remark on her second morning, and set it back on the shelf, exactly where she had found it, at the very end, half hidden, and told herself she would think further on it another day, when she had learned enough of the room's other, plainer contents to properly appreciate whatever this smaller, stranger thing might turn out to mean. She turned instead to the work table running down the room's center, and to the small writing desk, built into an alcove at its far end, a compact affair with a slanted lid and a single narrow drawer beneath, and found the lid unlocked and lifted it to find a shallow compartment holding pens and a nearly dried inkwell and a stack of blank labels ready for future filling, and beneath these, a book bound in worn brown leather, considerably thicker than the household ledgers upstairs, its spine soft and rounded with long handling. She lifted it out and opened the cover and found, on the first page, in the same small hand she had come to know so well over the preceding fortnight, the words "Receipts and Remedies," kept by M. Pruitt, followed by a date some 36 years past, the very year, she realized, that Mrs. Pruitt must first have taken up the post Eleanor now held herself. She turned the pages slowly, finding entry after careful entry, recipes for polishes and waters and remedies for 100 small household complaints, each entry dated, some added to and amended across many years as the recipe was refined through long practical use. And Eleanor understood, turning through page after page in the grey afternoon light of the still room, with the rain now falling steadily against the single window and the house settling quietly around her, that she was holding, in her two hands, something considerably more than a household recipe book. She was holding 36 years of a woman's daily, patient, careful attention, recorded in her own hand, refined across decades of practice, a whole working life distilled into these narrow, closely written pages. And she felt, closing the book gently and setting it back in its place in the desk, that Mr. Godwin had been entirely right, that she was indeed coming to know Mrs. Pruitt, page by page and jar by jar, in a way that felt, already, after only a fortnight, considerably more intimate than she had expected the acquaintance of a dead stranger to become. She locked the still-room door behind her when she left. An old habit, already forming though there was no one in the house who would have thought to enter without her leave, and went back along the passage toward the kitchen, with the rain still falling steadily beyond the windows and the early dusk of late October already beginning to gather in the corners of the house. And she found herself thinking, as she walked, not of the recipes she had read or the ordinary domestic wisdom recorded in that careful hand, but of the single unlabeled jar at the end of the topmost shelf, the small star-shaped flowers she could not name, the scratched initial, and the date some 4 decades past, a full 6 years before Mrs. Pruitt had even taken up her post at Millbrook Hall. And she understood, without yet having any way to explain the understanding to herself, that this was the thread she would eventually need to follow, though she was not yet ready. Not on this quiet, rain-soft Tuesday in her second week in the house, to follow it any further than the simple, patient noticing of its presence. That evening, after the household supper, and before the fire in her own room had burned down enough to need banking for the night, Eleanor took out the topmost of the tied ledgers once more and sat at the desk that had been Mrs. Pruitt's desk, in the chair that had been Mrs. Pruitt's chair, and began, for the first time, to write her own entries on the blank pages that followed the final unfinished record from June, not from any particular urgency, but because it felt, suddenly, like the right evening to begin, the house quiet around her, the rain still falling softly against the window, the whole long unfolding mystery of the place still ahead of her, waiting, she thought, the way the still room's locked drawers and unlabeled jars were waiting, to be understood a little at a time, across however many seasons it would take. In whatever careful, patient hand, she found herself developing to match the one that had come before hers. She wrote the date, and beneath it a brief, plain record of the week's small business. Coal ordered, linen inventoried, the West Wing's dust sheets checked and found sound, and set down her pen and looked at the page for a long moment before closing the book and retying its ribbon, and found, doing so, that the small private ceremony of it, the continuing of a record another woman had kept for 36 years and could keep no longer, settled something in her that she had not entirely realized needed settling. A sense of having properly begun, at last, not merely arrived. She banked the fire and undressed and got into the narrow bed, and lay for a while listening to the rain, which had softened now to something gentler, a steady, patient whisper against the glass, and to the old house settling around her the way it had settled every night for centuries before her arrival, and would, she supposed, go on settling for a great many centuries after she herself was nothing more than a name in a ledger somewhere. And she thought, drifting toward sleep, of the small, unlabeled jar at the end of the topmost shelf, the star-shaped flowers, the scratched initial, the date some 4 decades past, and told herself, as sleep came properly for her at last, that tomorrow, or perhaps the day after, when the rain had cleared and the light in the still room was better suited to close examination, she would take the jar down again and look at it properly, and begin, in whatever small way the house was prepared to allow her, to follow the thread it offered toward whatever quiet, private story lay at its other end. The rain held through the night and into the following morning, softening by breakfast into a fine, drifting mist that hung low over the kitchen garden and blurred the line where the garden wall met the grey sky beyond it. And Eleanor took her tea standing at the kitchen window, watching it move slowly across the cabbage beds and the bare canes of the raspberries, and found herself thinking, not for the first time since her arrival, of how differently a house revealed itself, depending on the weather it wore. In sunlight, she imagined Millbrook would show one face, the stone warming to gold, the long gallery's windows throwing bright rectangles across the floor, the kitchen garden green and orderly and productive. In mist, it showed quite another, softer and more private, the house seeming to draw its grounds in close around itself, the way a person draws a shawl closer against a chill. And Eleanor thought she was coming, already, only a fortnight in, to prefer this second face, finding in it something more suited to the slow, patient work of actually coming to know the place rather than merely admiring it. Mrs. Doyle joined her at the window with her own cup, following her gaze out toward the garden, and the two women stood for a companionable moment in silence before Mrs. Doyle spoke, in the easy, unhurried way she had of introducing a subject without quite announcing that she was introducing it. "You've been at the still room, I noticed." Peggy said the key was gone from its hook 2 afternoons running. "I have," Eleanor said. "There's a great deal to learn in there, more than I expected, if I'm honest. It isn't only herbs and polishes. There's a whole book of receipts, kept across 36 years. And I confess, I could have sat with it a good deal longer than I allowed myself yesterday." Something moved across Mrs. Doyle's broad, weathered face. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one, private and a little sad. She loved that room better than any other in the house, I always thought. Better even than her own. I used to tell her she'd have made a fine apothecary in another life, had she been born a man and allowed the training for it. She only ever laughed and said, The house gave her all the scope she needed, and I dare say she was right. Seeing what she built in there over the years, she turned her cup slowly on its saucer. The same small, unconscious gesture Eleanor had noticed on her first evening. "You'll have seen the little jar then. The one with no proper label, tucked up at the end." Eleanor turned from the window, her attention sharpening. "I did." A single letter scratched into the glass, and a date, some 4 decades past, if I read it rightly. Before her time here, I think, unless I've misjudged the years. 6 years before, near enough, Mrs. Doyle said. She was a young woman still, back then, not yet come to Millbrook at all. I don't know the whole of that story, Miss Hartley, and what I do know isn't rightly mine to tell. Her having kept it close her whole life, and never offering more than the barest edges of it even to me. And I, 22 years, her closest companion below stairs. But I'll say this much, since I think you've a right to know there's something there worth the gentle handling. She kept that jar with her every situation she ever held, long before Millbrook, and moved it herself, personally, packed it in her own trunk, rather than trusting it to the general baggage every single time she changed a place. That's not the behavior of a woman keeping dried flowers for their scent, Miss Hartley. That's the behavior of a woman keeping something a good deal more particular than that. Eleanor said nothing for a moment, turning this new small piece of information over alongside the others she had already gathered. The initial, the date, the careful scratching into glass rather than the usual paper label, and felt the quiet, patient curiosity that had been building in her since her first afternoon in the still room settle into something firmer, something closer to purpose. "I won't press you for more than you're willing to give," she said at last. "But I think, if it's all the same to you, I should like to understand it properly in time. In whatever way the house is willing to let me. It feels owed to her, somehow, though I couldn't rightly explain why I feel that so strongly, having never known her." "No, Mrs. Doyle said. I don't suppose you could explain it. I'm not sure I could myself. And I knew the woman 22 years. She set down her cup with a small, decisive click against its saucer, the gesture of someone drawing a private conversation to its natural close before it went further than she had intended to take it. "Well, there's bread wants shaping, and you'll have your own morning's business waiting. But I'm glad you're minded to be careful with it, whatever it turns out to be. She deserves that much, I think, whoever she was, to the man whose initial that is." Eleanor spent the following days settling more deeply into the rhythm of the house, learning the particular creak of the 3rd stair on the servants' staircase, learning which of the below-stairs doors stuck in damp weather and which swelled shut entirely in a hard frost, learning the names and small habits of the outdoor staff who came and went through the kitchen door on their various errands. The gardener, a taciturn man named Fenner, who grew, she discovered on a clear afternoon toward the end of her 2nd week, the very lavender and roses whose dried remnants filled so many of the still room's jars in a walled bed along the garden's southern wall, cut back now for the winter. But clearly, from the size and shape of the old woody stems, plantings of considerable age, tended with a care that matched, in its own outdoor fashion, the careful indoor attention Mrs. Pruitt had given the drying and storing of what Fenner's beds produced. She walked the walled garden with him one grey, still afternoon. The mist of the previous days having cleared to a thin, pale October sunlight that did little to warm the air, but a great deal to lift the general spirit of the place. And Fenner, a man of few words but evidently considerable pride in his beds, showed her the lavender rose, cut back to low grey-green mounds now, and explained, in his slow, careful way, that Mrs. Pruitt had chosen the varieties herself years back, had walked the beds with him every summer at the height of the flowering to select which rose would be cut for drying and which left for the bees, and had never once, in all his years working under her direction, failed to know exactly which plant in which row had come from which source, a knowledge he confessed he himself had never fully mastered, despite tending the beds with his own hands every season. "There's one row she never let me touch at all," he said, gesturing with his spade toward a narrower bed set slightly apart from the others along the garden's western wall, catching what afternoon sun there was to be had in that sheltered corner. Not for cutting, not for shaping, not even for the ordinary weeding I'd do everywhere else. She saw to that row herself, every single year, on her hands and knees in her own apron rather than sending for me, and never once told me why, and I never once asked, it not being my place, and she, not being a woman who invited questions she hadn't chosen to answer herself. Eleanor walked to the edge of the narrower bed and looked down at it. The plants within it smaller and less vigorous than the great sweeping rows elsewhere in the garden, a variety she did not recognize, the leaves a slightly different shade of grey-green. The whole planting having the look of something kept alive through patient, individual attention, rather than the easy abundance of the larger beds around it. She crouched and touched one of the small woody stems gently, and thought of the unlabeled jar on the topmost shelf, the star-shaped dried flowers within it, and felt, crouching there in the thin afternoon light, with the walled garden quiet around her, and Fenner waiting a respectful few paces off, that she had found, without quite meaning to go looking for it on this particular afternoon, another thread of the same pattern, another small, careful, private thing that Mrs. Pruitt had tended alone and explained to no one, for reasons that had died with her in June and left behind only these scattered traces, a jar, a row, an initial scratched into glass, for whoever came after to gather up and, perhaps, in time, to understand. She thanked Fenner for the tour and walked back toward the house slowly, along the gravel path that ran between the walled garden and the kitchen door, and found her thoughts turning, as they had turned more and more often over the preceding days, to the small brown leather book she had found in the still-room desk, the receipts and remedies kept across 36 years, in that same careful, upright hand, and to the writing desk itself, which she had examined only briefly on her first visit, and which she suspected, now, might hold more than the single shallow compartment she had opened, a suspicion that hardened into something closer to certainty when she returned to the still-room that same evening after the household supper, and ran her hand along the desk's underside out of simple, careful curiosity, and found, tucked beneath the writing surface, where it met the desk's narrow leg, a second, smaller drawer, so shallow and so close-fitted to the wood around it, that she had entirely missed it on her first inspection, its front carved with the same simple molding as the rest of the desk, so that it read, at a glance, as decoration rather than as a door to anything at all. She knelt and examined it more closely in the light of the single lamp she had carried in with her, and found a small keyhole set into its front, considerably smaller than any of the keys on the great ring at her waist, a keyhole clearly meant for something more delicate. A small, personal key, rather than the heavy household keys that opened doors and cupboards, and the great linen presses upstairs. She tried, without much hope, several of the smaller keys on her ring, and found, as she had expected, that none of them fit, the drawer's lock being of a finer, more particular manufacture than anything else in the room. And she sat back on her heels in the lamplight and looked at the small drawer for a long moment, and understood that she had found, on this quiet Thursday evening in her third week at Millbrook Hall, the next and perhaps the most important thread in the pattern she had been gathering since her first afternoon in this room. A locked drawer built into a dead woman's writing desk, clearly meant to hold something its owner had wished to keep more private even than the careful 36-year record of receipts and remedies in the book above it, and no key anywhere on the great ring that Mr. Godwin had placed in her hands with such careful ceremony on her second morning in the house. She sat with the small drawer a while longer, tracing the carved moulding with one finger, feeling the faint give of old, well-fitted wood, and thought of the unlabeled jar on the shelf above her, and the narrow, carefully tended row in the walled garden outside, and the single scratched initial, and the date some 4 decades past, and felt the whole quiet shape of the mystery she had stumbled into settle a little more firmly into place. Not yet understood, not yet even properly begun, but felt now, definitely, as a real and particular thing rather than a vague impression gathered from scattered small details. A story that Mrs. Pruitt had carried with her through every situation she had ever held, packed personally in her own trunk, tended on her own knees, in her own apron, locked away in a drawer too small and too particular to be opened by any of the ordinary household keys, a story that had ended, whatever its shape, with its keeper's death in June, and no one left behind who knew where its final small key might be found. She rose at last, her knees stiff from kneeling on the cold stone floor, and blew out the lamp, and locked the still-room door behind her with the same care she had shown every evening since her first visit, and climbed the narrow servant's stair to her own room at the corridor's end, where the fire had burned low, and the wing chair sat waiting in its familiar worn shape, and the row of jars on the little shelf beside the fireplace caught the last of the firelight in their small, patient way, and she undressed and got into bed and lay for a long while in the dark, turning the small mystery of the locked drawer over and over in her mind, and thought, before sleep finally came for her, that she would begin tomorrow, or in the days soon after, a careful and patient search of the room and the desk, and perhaps, if it came to it, of Mrs. Pruitt's own effects, wherever they had been kept since June, for a small key that might fit a small lock, and that she would not hurry the search, and would not force the drawer, however strong her curiosity grew in the meantime, because it seemed to her, lying there in the dark with the house settling quietly around her, that whatever Mrs. Pruitt had kept locked away in that narrow space had been kept there deliberately, and carried, and tended, and guarded, across 4 decades and several situations and one long, careful working life, and deserved at the very least to be found rather than forced, uncovered rather than broken into, by whoever came in time and with patience, and with the same careful attention Mrs. Pruitt herself had given to everything else in this quiet, well-kept house. She slept eventually, and dreamed, this time, though only faintly and without any clear shape she could recall, on waking, of a walled garden in high summer, lavender in full flower and heavy with bees, and a narrow row along the western wall that she could not, in the dream, quite bring herself to approach closely enough to see clearly, and she woke in the grey hour before dawn with the dream already dissolving at its edges the way dreams do, and lay for a while listening to the first stirrings of the house below her, and thought, before rising to begin another day's quiet work, that the answer, whatever it turned out to be, would come to her in its own time. The way the house itself seemed to reveal itself in its own time, a room and a season and a small careful detail at a time, and that there was no particular need to hurry toward it. The whole long winter still ahead of her, and the house, and its keys, and its quiet, patient mysteries, entirely, now, her own to keep. The days that followed carried her through the last week of October and into the first cold mornings of November. The mist giving way now to sharper, clearer weather, frost silvering the kitchen garden's beds each morning, and the walled lavender rose standing grey and dormant, under a sky gone a hard, pale blue. And Eleanor found her days filling with the ordinary, steady business of a house settling into winter, coal ordered in greater quantity, fires laid earlier in the afternoon, as the light failed sooner each day, the linen presses checked and turned and found, room by room, sound and orderly, exactly as 36 years of careful keeping had left them. She did not force the small locked drawer, though she thought of it often, in quiet moments below stairs and in the last waking minutes before sleep each night. And she did not press Mrs. Doyle for more than the older woman seemed willing to give, understanding, by instinct, more than by anything she could have put plainly into words, that some things in a house as old and as carefully kept as this one revealed themselves only to patience, only to the slow, daily accumulation of small attention, the very quality Mrs. Pruitt herself seemed to have given to everything she had touched across her long years in this room, in this house, in this quiet, particular corner of Derbyshire. She continued her own entries in the household ledger each evening, a habit now rather than a novelty. Her handwriting still her own, but settling, she noticed, without quite intending it, into something a little steadier, a little more careful, as though the desk itself, and the chair, and the worn cushion, shaped by another woman's long years of sitting exactly there, were teaching her something of the patience the work required, page by page, week by week, the way the whole house seemed determined to teach her everything else. And so the month turned, and the fires burned a little longer each evening, and the small key that would open the last of Mrs. Pruitt's careful secrets remained, for now, undiscovered, somewhere in the quiet fabric of a house that Eleanor Hartley was only just beginning, in her own turn and in her own time, to properly know. Welcome back to Soft Sleep Tales. If you are joining us again this evening, thank you for returning to these quiet stories night after night. As always, you're welcome to share where you're listening from in the comments below. And if these tales help bring you rest, please consider subscribing so we can continue this journey together. Now settle in once more. Let your body grow heavy and warm. Take a slow breath in and a slower breath out, and let my voice carry you back into the quiet halls of Millbrook and towards sleep. November settled properly over Millbrook Hall in the days that followed, the frost holding later into each morning, the walled garden's beds gone entirely to their winter starkness, the lavender rose no more now than low grey mounds waiting out the cold, and Eleanor Hartley found the rhythm of the house closing in around her, the way a house does close in around its keeper. As the year turns toward its darkest months, fires wanted earlier, coal wanted in greater quantity, the whole below-stairs world drawing its attention inward, toward warmth and provisioning and the long, patient work of simply keeping a great house comfortable through a season that seemed determined, some mornings, to test the very idea of comfort. She had not forgotten the small locked drawer, tucked beneath the writing desk in the still room, its keyhole too fine and too particular for any key on the great ring at her waist. She thought of it often, in the quiet hour after the household supper, when the fire in her own room burned low and the wing chair held her in its long-worn shape, and she had begun, in the small spare pockets of time her days afforded her, a careful and unhurried search for whatever key might fit it, though she had promised herself, that first night of discovery, that she would not force the matter, and she had kept, so far, to that promise. She began, reasonably enough, with Mrs. Pruitt's own effects, and it was Mr. Godwin consulted carefully over the household accounts one grey Tuesday morning, who told her where these had been kept since June. There had been, he explained, no family to speak of, or none that had come forward. A distant cousin in Nottinghamshire having been written to and having declined, by return post, any interest in claiming what little the dead woman had left behind. And so her personal effects, what there were of them, had been gathered by Mrs. Doyle herself in the days after the funeral and placed respectfully and without much ceremony in a single travelling trunk, and the trunk carried up to the box room at the top of the house, there to wait, Mr. Godwin supposed, for some eventual decision about its disposal that nobody had yet felt the heart to make. "You're welcome to look through it, if you think it might help you in your work," he said, in the careful, slightly formal way he had of offering permission for things he suspected mattered more than the plain words of the offer suggested. "I confess I have wondered once or twice myself what became of certain small things she kept about her, without ever quite finding the occasion to go and look. If you go up, Miss Hartley, I hope you'll do it gently." She was not a woman who invited intrusion, even after her death, I think, though I dare say that's a foolish thing to say of someone no longer able to mind one way or the other. "I don't think it foolish at all," Eleanor said, and meant it, and thanked him, and climbed, that same afternoon, the narrower and steeper stair that led up past the family's own rooms to the low, sloped-ceilinged attics under the roof, where the box room sat at the passage's far end, cold and dim, lit only by a single small dormer window through which the grey November light came thin and reluctant, falling across a scattering of old furniture kept from earlier generations, a broken chair, a stack of picture frames turned to the wall, and, set apart from the rest, a single travelling trunk, black-painted, its corners bound in brass, gone dull with disuse, a small brass plate on its lid bearing, in worn engraved letters, the initials M.P. She knelt before it in the cold, thin light and lifted the lid, which was unlocked, and found within a life folded away with the same careful, economical precision that had marked everything else Mrs. Pruitt had left behind. A few good dresses wrapped in tissue, a shawl, a small collection of books, mostly practical, a herbal, a household manual, a single slim volume of poetry that surprised Eleanor a little, its spine well broken from long reading, And beneath these, wrapped in a square of soft flannel, a small rosewood sewing box, its lid inlaid with a simple pattern of lighter wood, clearly old, clearly well kept, clearly, Eleanor thought, turning it over gently in her hands, a possession from very early in its owner's life, rather than something acquired in the comfortable middle years of a settled position. She lifted the lid and found within the ordinary apparatus of sewing, needles and thread, wound neatly on small bone spools, and a slender pair of scissors shaped, in the old style, like a stalk, its long, thin blades forming the bird's beak. And beneath these, in a shallow compartment, she nearly missed entirely, a single small key, brass, delicately cut, entirely unlike anything else on the great household ring, small enough to sit easily in the palm of her hand. And she knew, holding it, turning it in the thin attic light, that she had found, at last, the thing she had been patiently, unhurriedly searching for since that Thursday evening 3 weeks before. She sat a while longer with the little sewing box open on her knees before closing it, looking at the small, ordinary objects it held, a stub of chalk for marking hems, a paper of pins gone slightly rusted at their points, a length of grey-blue ribbon wound carefully round a scrap of card, the same soft colour, she noticed, as the ribbon that tied the household ledgers upstairs, and she wondered, looking at it, whether the colour had been chosen once, long ago, for some particular reason now lost, or had simply become, through long habit and long fondness, the colour a careful woman reached for without quite thinking why. The way a person comes to prefer one chair over another, one path through a garden over another, without ever troubling to examine the preference too closely, she thought, closing the box at last and wrapping it back in its square of soft flannel, that she would likely never know the answer to that particular small question, and found, thinking it, that she did not much mind the not knowing, understanding by now that a portion of any life, however carefully documented in ledgers and letters and labeled jars, remains simply and permanently private, known only to the person who lived it, and that this, too, was owed a measure of respect rather than an anxious wish to have every last thread accounted for. She set the little box back precisely as she had found it, tucked beneath the folded shawl and the wrapped books, and closed the lid of the trunk on the quiet remainder of a life she suspected she would never entirely finish coming to know, and found that she was glad of that, glad of the small remaining privacies still folded away in the cold attic dark, waiting for no one in particular to ever fully uncover them. She did not go directly to the still room. She sat for a while longer beside the open trunk, the small key held loosely in her hand, and found herself reluctant, now that the search was actually concluded, to move too quickly toward its resolution, understanding, in some manner she did not examine too closely, that she was standing at the edge of something that had been kept private and carefully guarded for the better part of a lifetime, and that the crossing of that edge deserved, at the very least, to be done deliberately rather than in a rush of triumphant curiosity. She closed the trunk gently and refolded the flannel around the little sewing box, though she kept the key itself, closed now, in her own hand, and went back down through the quiet, cold passages of the house, past the family's shut-up rooms, past the long gallery with its row of watching portraits, down the servants' stair, to the below-stairs world, where Mrs. Doyle was at work over the evening supper, and Peggy was laying the servants' hall table, and she said nothing to either of them, of what she carried in her closed hand, not from any wish to keep secrets from women who had shown her nothing but kindness since her arrival, but because the matter felt, for the moment, too new and too private, even to her own understanding to be properly shared. She went to the still room that evening. After the household supper was cleared and the kitchen had settled into its quiet end-of-day stillness, carrying a single lamp and the small brass key, and let herself in and locked the door behind her, a precaution she had never before taken in that room and took now without quite examining why, and knelt before the little carved drawer beneath the writing desk and fitted the key to its lock, and found, with a small mechanical click that seemed very loud in the room's deep quiet, that it turned smoothly, as though the lock had been waiting, oiled and ready, all these months. For exactly this moment, the drawer slid open on a bundle of letters, perhaps a dozen, tied with a faded ribbon, the same soft grey blue as the dried flowers in the jar upstairs, and beneath them, wrapped in a scrap of paper gone soft and brown with age, a single pressed flower, star-shaped, violet blue, unmistakably a match to the dried specimens in the unlabeled jar on the shelf above her, and beneath the flower, at the very bottom of the drawer, a small, oval miniature portrait, no larger than the palm of her hand, set in a plain, thin frame of gilt, gone soft with handling, painted on ivory in the delicate, slightly formal style of some 4 decades past, showing a young man of perhaps 25, fair-haired, open-faced, dressed in the plain good coat of a working man risen a little in the world, a sprig of some small flower worked in, whether by the painter's invention or the sitter's own request. Eleanor could not tell, into the buttonhole of that coat, his expression caught by the painter in a look of quiet, steady warmth that seemed, even across the gap of 40 years and the death of everyone who had known him, to reach directly across the small room and settle on Eleanor with something like recognition. She turned it gently in the lamplight, studying the careful, small brushwork, the particular attentive tenderness with which the unknown painter had rendered the set of the young man's mouth, very slightly amused, as though caught in the middle of some private, pleasant thought. And she found herself wondering, looking at it, whether the portrait had been commissioned as a formal gift, the sort of thing exchanged between a couple with a settled understanding between them, or whether it had been a more private undertaking altogether, paid for out of a young gardener's modest wages, and given, perhaps, as a surprise. On some occasion the letters might yet reveal to her, should she choose, in time, to read them again more carefully still. The back of the little frame, she discovered, turning it over, held a small oval of paper, glued neatly beneath a thin backing of wood, and on it, in a hand she did not recognize, presumably the painter's own rather than either of the 2 young people the portrait had been made for, a single line, the sitter's name and the year, confirming what Eleanor had already, by then, come to understand without needing any further confirmation at all. She sat back on her heels and held the miniature to the lamplight and looked at it for a long while, and then, carefully, reverently, untied the faded ribbon and began, with the same patience she had brought to every other part of her slow, unhurried search, to read. The letters were dated across a span of perhaps 18 months, some 4 decades in the past, written in a strong, plain, careful hand. Clearly a man not much used to letter writing, but determined, in these particular letters, to do the business properly. And they told, across their careful, unhurried pages, a story that Eleanor pieced together slowly, letter by letter, understanding growing between the lines rather than announced outright in any single passage. The young man's name had been Matthew, a head gardener's apprentice, it seemed, at a house some considerable distance from Millbrook, in a county, the letters named only in passing, and the young woman he wrote to, addressed throughout simply as, "My dear M." Though Eleanor understood at once that this was affectionate shorthand rather than any confusion of names, was, unmistakably, the young Mrs. Pruitt, some 4 decades younger than the careful, dignified housekeeper Eleanor had come to know only through the traces she had left behind. The early letters spoke of small, ordinary things: a garden's progress through a season, a walk taken, a book lent and returned, the plain, warm currency of 2 young people growing steadily fonder of each other across the patient months of a courtship conducted, it seemed, largely through correspondence, the 2 of them in service at houses, some distance apart and able to meet only rarely, on holidays and the occasional arranged Sunday. But the letters deepened as they went on, grew warmer and more certain, until, in one dated the spring of that long-past year, Matthew wrote plainly of his hope that they might one day keep a garden of their own, however small, and named, with a young man's careful, hopeful precision, the particular flowers he thought she would want in it. Lavender chief among them, for the bees, he wrote, and for the smell of it on a summer evening, which he had noticed, he confessed, was the thing that seemed to settle her most completely. On the rare occasions he had seen her tired or low in spirits, a single sprig of it crushed between her fingers and held to her face. Eleanor read this passage twice, and then a 3rd time, and understood, reading it, precisely why a young woman who would one day become the most careful and thorough housekeeper Millbrook Hall had known in living memory had spent 36 years surrounding herself, in every room she properly controlled, with the dried remnants of that particular flower, filling jar after jar with it, tending a private row of it in every garden she ever had charge of, carrying always, packed personally in her own trunk rather than trusted to the ordinary baggage, a single small unlabeled jar of a variety she never explained to anyone and never needed to, because the explanation had been written down in a young man's careful hand, in a letter kept for 40 years in a locked drawer that only she had ever possessed the key to. The later letters grew shorter, and then, abruptly, stopped. The last in the bundle was dated only a few months after the one that had spoken of a garden of their own, and it was different from the others, written in a hand less steady than the rest, and it spoke in careful, restrained language that seemed to Eleanor, reading it in the quiet, lamplit stillroom, to be working very hard to hold back something considerably less restrained beneath it, of an illness that had come on suddenly, a fever, the doctor uncertain, and of his hope, expressed plainly and without self-pity, that she would not trouble herself to come, the distance being what it was, and his own situation, he was confident, soon to improve. There was no letter after it. Eleanor sat for a long while with the small bundle in her lap, understanding, without needing any further document to confirm it, that no improvement had come, that the young gardener named Matthew had died that same year, some 4 decades past, and that the young woman who would become Mrs. Pruitt had carried the single pressed flower from whatever last small gift or token had passed between them. and had scratched his initial into the glass of a jar she filled. Thereafter, every single year of her working life, with the same flower he had once named as her favorite, and had never married, and had never, so far as anyone at Millbrook, or presumably at any house she had ever served, knew, spoken his name aloud to a living soul. She sat with the drawer open a good while before beginning, simply looking at the small assembled collection of it, the letters, the flower, the portrait, laid out together in the lamplight, for what she suspected was the first time in 40 years that any living eye but Mrs. Pruitt's own had rested on the three of them at once. And only then, slowly, did she read on, before wrapping them away, through the middle letters of the bundle, the ones written in that long-past summer when the courtship had clearly been at its warmest, and found in them a young man's plain, unpracticed tenderness, set down with a care that seemed to Eleanor, reading it across the gap of 40 years, entirely undiminished by time, undiminished by the fact that the hand that had written it was long since still, and the paper itself gone soft and brown at its folds. He wrote of a half-day's holiday spent walking out together along a river she did not know the name of a hat she had worn that he had teased her about, and then, in a later letter, confessed he had thought of constantly since, of small plans for a future, neither of them yet possessed the means to properly build, but which he set down anyway, in careful, hopeful detail: a cottage with a good south wall for fruit trees, a bed of the flowers she favored set where the kitchen window would catch their scent on a warm evening, a life imagined into being across the patient exchange of letters between two young people in service at houses some considerable distance apart, meeting only rarely, and building, in the meantime, an entire private world out of paper and ink and the steady accumulation of small shared understanding. One letter, dated the autumn of that same long-past year, spoke of his hopes for the following spring, of a position he had heard might soon come open nearer to where she was then in service, in head gardener at a smaller house, modest but respectable, that would allow them, he wrote, with a carefulness that could not quite disguise how much the hope meant to him, to be married by the following Michaelmas, if all went as he trusted it would. Eleanor read this passage slowly, and read it again, understanding, with a fresh, small ache, that the following spring the letters spoke of, with such patient hope, had been the very spring in which instead the fever had come, and the position never taken up, and the following Michaelmas had arrived and passed, with the young woman who would have been married that season, instead standing, presumably, in some other house entirely, keeping her grief as privately and as thoroughly as she would go on to keep everything else for the rest of her working life. She sat for a long while, after finishing the last letter, the small bundle resting in her lap, the lamp burning steadily beside her, and found her thoughts turning, unexpectedly, to her own situation, her own 30 years, without any particular romantic attachment of note, her own quiet, orderly progress through a series of respectable positions, and she wondered, sitting there in the hushed still room with the snow beginning, she could tell, from the particular deadened quality of the sound beyond the window, to fall outside, whether she had simply been fortunate never to have been given cause for a grief of this particular shape, or whether there was, in the plain, practical single-mindedness she had always brought to her work, something of the same quiet retreat into duty that she now recognized, with a fuller understanding, in every ledger entry and every carefully filled jar that Mrs. Pruitt had left behind her. She did not resolve the question that evening, and did not expect to resolve it easily, but she found that the asking of it, prompted by another woman's 40-year-old letters, had opened something in her own understanding of herself that she suspected would take a good deal longer than a single lamplit evening to properly settle. She mentioned a little of what she had found to Mrs. Doyle 2 days later, choosing her words with care, offering only the barest outline, that she had come across some old letters belonging to a young man Mrs. Pruitt had once been fond of, long before Millbrook, and that he had died young, and that she thought she now understood a good deal better why certain things in the still-room and the garden had always been kept so particularly. Mrs. Doyle listened without much visible surprise, nodding slowly over her mending as Eleanor spoke, and when Eleanor had finished, sat quiet for a moment before answering. "I always suspected there was a young man in it somewhere," she said at last. "She let slip a thing or two across the years, not meaning to, I think. Once, a long while back, I asked her outright why she'd never married, thinking nothing of the asking, the way you do sometimes without weighing your words properly first. And she went very still and very quiet for a moment before she answered me, and then she said only that she had been asked once and had been going to say yes, and that the asking had never come to anything, through no fault of anyone living, and that she'd rather not speak further of it if I didn't mind. I never asked again, but I thought of it now and then, watching her out at that western row every summer, on her knees in the dirt, with a look on her face I never quite had the words for. And I think, Miss Hartley, that you've done a kind thing, finding what you found and understanding it properly rather than simply clearing it away as old rubbish, which is what a less thoughtful woman might have done with a locked drawer full of another person's dead letters. "I couldn't have cleared it away," Eleanor said. "It didn't feel like rubbish. It felt like the truest thing in the whole house." Mrs. Doyle looked at her for a long moment, her needle stilled over her mending, and something in her broad, weathered face softened into an expression of plain, unguarded approval. "Aye," she said again, as she had said on Eleanor's first evening. "You'll keep this house properly, I think. Better than properly. She'd have been glad of you, Miss Hartley. Whatever else I can't rightly say about a woman I knew 22 years, and never once fully understood." She wrapped the letters carefully back in their faded ribbon, and folded the pressed flower back into its soft brown paper, and held the small ivory miniature a while longer in the lamplight, looking at the young man's open, steady face, before setting it, too, gently back into the drawer. She understood, sitting there in the quiet still room with the lamp burning low and the house settled entirely around her, that she had been given, through no design or right of her own beyond the simple accident of having taken up a post left vacant by a death, the whole of a private grief that had shaped a woman's entire working life without ever once being spoken of. And she felt the weight of that gift, for it felt to her very much like a gift rather than an intrusion, settle into her with a gravity considerably greater than anything else the house had shown her since her arrival. She did not lock the drawer again that night. She left it as it was, the letters and the flower and the small painted portrait resting together in the dark beneath the desk, and sat instead for a long while in the room's single chair, a plain wooden thing set beside the work table rather than the wing chair in her own room, and thought about what, if anything, she ought now to do with what she had found and what she had come, in the space of a single evening, to understand, she thought first, and set aside almost as quickly the idea of doing nothing at all, of returning the key to the little rosewood sewing box and the trunk to its place in the cold attic, and simply carrying on, keeper of a secret she alone now possessed. It did not feel right to her, sitting there, to let the discovery end in nothing, to let the careful 40-year devotion she had just read the shape of settle back into silence and dust. But neither did it feel right to speak of it, to carry the story down to the kitchen and share it, however gently, with Mrs. Doyle, who had, after all, known Mrs. Pruitt 22 years, and had never once been told. A silence that had clearly been deliberate and clearly deserved, even now, some measure of continued respect. She thought, instead of the narrow lavender row in the walled garden, tended by Mrs. Pruitt's own hands every year of her long service, touched by no one else, and she thought of the jars on the shelf above her, and the small, unlabeled one at their end, and she understood, sitting quietly in the still room, with the lamp burning low, exactly what it was she was meant to do. Not because any instruction had been left for her, no letter addressed to her successor, no note tucked among the papers explaining what ought to become of any of it, but because the pattern of the whole story, once properly understood, seemed to Eleanor to point toward a single, clear, and simple conclusion, that the row should continue to be tended by her own hands now, on her own knees, in her own apron, exactly as it had always been tended, and that the jar should continue to be filled each year at harvest and set in its accustomed place at the end of the topmost shelf, unlabeled still, because it had never needed a label to be understood by the one person who had known what it meant, and would not need one now to be understood in a quieter and more distant way by the one person who came after her. She rose at last, stiff from the long stillness of sitting, and closed the drawer gently, though she did not turn the key in its lock, deciding, in that moment, that the little drawer had been locked long enough, that its contents, however privately they had been kept across 4 decades, deserved now simply to rest, unhidden even if unremarked, in the room that had held them so faithfully for so long. She blew out the lamp and let herself out, locking the still room's outer door as she always did, and climbed the narrow stair to her own room, where the fire had burned low and the row of jars on the little shelf caught what remained of the firelight. And she sat for a while in the wing chair, in the worn shape another woman's long years had left there, and found herself, for the first time since her arrival at Millbrook, weeping quietly, not from any grief of her own, but from the particular, borrowed grief of having come across a single lamplit evening to properly know a woman she had never met and would never now be able to meet, to know the shape of the one loss that had settled, quietly and permanently, beneath everything else that woman had ever done, every ledger kept, every jar filled, every careful entry made in that same small, upright hand, across 36 patient years. She slept, eventually, and woke the following morning to a hard, bright frost. The kind of clear, cold November morning that makes a house's chimneys smoke straight up into a windless sky and she went about her ordinary work with the particular quiet, settled feeling of someone who has crossed some private threshold in the night and finds the ordinary world the next morning entirely unchanged by it, and yet somehow different all the same. She said nothing to Mrs. Doyle, though she caught the older woman looking at her once or twice across the kitchen table with an expression that suggested she had noticed something in Eleanor's manner without being able to name it, and Eleanor let the look pass without comment, understanding that whatever had changed in her overnight was hers to carry quietly. In the same manner, Mrs. I.J. Pruitt had carried her own particular knowledge for 36 years without ever once needing to share the whole of it with anyone at all. The weeks that followed carried the house deeper into winter, the frost holding now most mornings until nearly midday, the first proper snow arriving in the last week of November, a soft, quiet fall that lay unbroken across the parkland, beyond the kitchen garden wall, and made the whole world visible from the below-stairs windows into something hushed and simplified. White fields, black bare oaks, a sky the color of pewter pressing down close over the moor. Eleanor kept to her work with the same patient thoroughness she had brought to it from her first morning. The linen presses turned and checked, the coal accounts kept carefully against the coming cold, the household's small daily needs anticipated and met with the quiet, invisible competence that she had come to understand, more fully now than when Mr. Godwin had first described it to her, was the whole art and purpose of the position she held. She visited the still room often through those weeks, not always for any particular practical purpose, sometimes simply to sit for a while at the work table with the lamp lit against the early winter dusk. And she found, doing so, that the room's atmosphere had changed for her since that lamplit evening with the letters, had grown warmer somehow, more companionable, less a place of mystery to be gradually unraveled, and more a place she felt, increasingly, that she properly belonged, in the way a person belongs to a room they have come to understand completely. Every jar and every shelf and every small private history now known to her, or known as fully as it was ever likely to be known by anyone who had not lived it herself. She began, in December, with the first hard frosts, settling in properly, and the house preparing, at Mr. Godwin's direction, for the family's eventual Christmas arrival, the earliest of them expected in the new year, rather than for the holiday itself, to make her own small additions to the great brown leather book of receipts and remedies, adding, beneath Mrs. Pruitt's final entries, a handful of her own, a polish she had learned in Hampshire that worked especially well on the dark old oak of the long gallery, a remedy for chilblains that Mrs. Doyle had taught her and sworn by. And she found, writing these in her own hand, on the pages that followed 36 years of another woman's careful record, that the book felt, now, less like an inheritance to be preserved unchanged, and more like a living thing, a practice to be continued rather than merely honored, exactly as she had begun to understand, that lamplit evening in the still room, the whole of what Mrs. Pruitt had left behind was meant to be received. The gardener, Fenner, came to her one clear, bitterly cold morning in the second week of December, stamping the snow from his boots at the kitchen door, to ask, with his usual economy of words, whether she wished the narrow western bed mulched for the winter same as the rest, it being his habit, in previous years, to leave that particular row entirely to Mrs. Pruitt's own judgment and never quite knowing, this being his first winter without her, whether the new housekeeper would wish it tended the same careful way, or simply folded into the general management of the garden like everything else. "Mulch it the same as always," Eleanor said, standing in the cold doorway, with her shawl drawn close against the wind coming off the moor. "And in the spring, when it wants weeding and shaping, I'll see to it myself, same as she did. I'd take it kindly if you'd show me, when the time comes, exactly how she liked it kept, so far as you know it. And I'll learn the rest myself, the way she must have learned it, I suppose, when she first came to tending it." Fenner looked at her for a moment with an expression she could not entirely read, weathered and impassive as his face generally was. But something in it seemed, to Eleanor, to settle some small private question answered to his satisfaction, much as her answer to Mrs. Doyle weeks before, about a house remembering its people properly, had seemed to settle something in that older woman's careful, watching face. "I'll show you what I know of it, Miss Hartley," he said, "though I'll own it isn't a great deal. She never did explain the whys of it, only the hows, and I never pressed her for more, it not being my place, but I'm glad you mean to keep it going. Seemed a shame, this autumn, watching it standing there with no one much minding it beyond the ordinary care I give the rest of the beds." "It won't stand unminded again," Eleanor said, and found, saying it, that she meant it with a firmness that surprised her a little, a promise made not only to the patient, waiting gardener stamping snow from his boots in the cold doorway, but to the whole quiet, careful shape of the story she had spent the autumn slowly uncovering, letter by letter and jar by jar, in a locked drawer that no longer needed its lock, in a small brass key now returned to its rosewood box and its black-painted trunk in the cold attic, in a young man's open, steady face caught forever, at 25, in a small oval portrait that Eleanor had taken, in the days since that lamplit evening, to setting out on the still room's work table each time she worked there, and returning each time she left to its quiet place in the unlocked drawer, a small daily ritual of her own devising that felt, to her, like the proper and fitting way to keep faith with a story she had been given no right to beyond the simple accident of having come, in her turn, to keep this particular house. Christmas approached slowly across the following weeks, the house filling with the particular, quiet, anticipatory business of a great household preparing for its family's eventual return, greenery gathered from the estate's own woods and dressed along the mantels of the rooms that would soon be opened again, the kitchen busy from early morning with the beginnings of preserved fruit and the slow, patient work of a Christmas larder. And Eleanor found herself, through all of it, settling more completely into the rhythm and the character of the house than she would have believed possible on that first grey October evening, when the carriage had drawn up at the servants' door, and Mrs. Doyle had come out to meet her with her hands folded at her waist. She had arrived a stranger to the house, competent and well recommended, but essentially unknown to it, and she found herself now, some 2 months later, moving through its cold stone passages and its warm below-stairs rooms with the easy, unthinking familiarity of someone who had always belonged there, who knew which floorboards spoke and which stayed silent, which fires drew well and which wanted coaxing, which jars on which shelf held which particular remedy for which particular small household complaint. The family arrived earlier than expected. In the end, a letter from Mr. Godwin's London correspondent reaching Millbrook only 4 days before their carriages actually appeared on the drive. And the house below stairs erupted, for the better part of that short interval, into the particular controlled urgency of a great household preparing itself at speed for the return of the people it existed to serve. Eleanor found herself directing the effort with a steadiness that surprised her a little, given that this was her first such occasion in her own right, rather than as an assistant carrying out another woman's instructions, dust sheets stripped from the principal rooms and the furniture beneath them polished and set right. Fires laid and lit in every room that would be wanted. The family's own private keys fetched down and matched, one by one, against the doors they opened. The kitchen given over entirely to Mrs. Doyle's command as she planned a first evening's dinner that would need to answer for a full 6 months of the family's absence without appearing, in its execution, to have been assembled in 4 days rather than 4 weeks. The family proved, on their arrival, exactly as easy to please as Mrs. Doyle had promised on Eleanor's first evening. Sir Robert Ashcombe, a broad, genial man in late middle age, with an evident fondness for his house and very little patience for ceremony. Lady Ashcombe, quieter and more particular, but not unkind, and their 2 grown daughters, down from London for the Christmas season, bringing with them a bright, chattering energy that filled the long gallery and the drawing-room with a warmth the house had not held. Eleanor suspected, since long before her own arrival in October, she was presented to the family on the first evening, in the hall, by Mr. Godwin, and found Lady Ashcombe's assessment of her brief, direct, and evidently satisfactory. A few questions about her previous situation, an observation that the house had seemed, on their arrival, remarkably well kept for so long a period without its mistress's supervision, and a final, simple instruction to carry on exactly as she had been doing, which Eleanor understood, standing there in the lamplit hall with the family's luggage still being carried in around her, to be as complete an endorsement as a new housekeeper could reasonably hope to receive in her first fortnight of actual service to the people whose house she kept. The days that followed carried the whole household, above stairs and below, into the particular bright, busy warmth of a country. Christmas properly kept. Greenery hung through every principal room. A great fire built up each evening in the drawing-room grate. The daughters organizing, with more enthusiasm than method, games and small entertainments for the handful of neighboring families invited to dine. And Eleanor found her days filled from before dawn until well past the family's own retiring hour, with the 100 small demands such a season brought. Linen wanted at short notice, an extra bed made up for an unexpected guest. The kitchen's output doubled, and then doubled again as the 12 days of the season wore on, and she managed it all. She came to understand with a quiet, private satisfaction. She allowed herself only in the last few minutes before sleep each night, with a competence that felt, to her own surprise, entirely natural, as though the whole autumn's patient learning of the house's every room and rhythm had been preparing her, without her fully realizing it, for precisely this test. On Christmas Eve itself, with the family and their guests settled in the drawing-room, and the below-stairs household allowed, for once, a quiet hour of its own before the evening's final duties, Eleanor slipped away alone to the still-room, carrying a small sprig of the dried lavender from the jar nearest the door, not the unlabeled one, at the shelf's far end, which she had come to think of as belonging to a private observance rather than a public one, and set it on the desk beside the little ivory portrait, and sat for a while in the lamplight, listening to the distant, muffled sound of laughter and a badly played but cheerfully offered carol drifting down from the drawing-room 2 floors above, and found herself, in that quiet, stolen hour, entirely content, in a manner she had not expected to feel so completely so early in her tenure of the post, with the whole shape of the life she had, almost by accident, come to be living, she thought, sitting there, of her own family, modest and scattered, and not much given to elaborate observance of the season, of the small, quiet Christmases of her own childhood, and found that she did not miss them so much as she might have expected to, finding in the great, busy, warmly lit house around her, and in the small private ritual she had just completed in the quiet lamplit still-room, a sense of belonging that felt, if anything, more complete than anything her own thinly scattered family had ever quite managed to provide her. She returned to the kitchen in time for the below-stairs household's own modest Christmas Eve supper. A good deal plainer than whatever was being served above, but no less warmly shared. Mrs. Doyle presiding over it with evident satisfaction at a season successfully navigated, Peggy flushed and pleased with a small gift of ribbon. Lady Ashcombe had thought to send down Fenner in for the evening from his cottage, and unusually talkative for the occasion, and Eleanor sat among them at the head of the below-stairs table, now by right of her position, and felt, for the first time since her arrival in October, entirely and unreservedly at home. On New Year's Eve, with the family's own celebration well underway above stairs, the below-stairs household kept its own smaller, quieter observance in the servants' hall, once the last of the evening's duties had been seen to, Mrs. Doyle producing a bottle of something warm and spiced that she confessed, with a rare small laugh, she had been keeping back for exactly this purpose since before Michaelmas. And the little gathering, Peggy and Fenner and the handful of other staff kept on through the family's residence, sat together, past their usual hour, trading the small, easy talk of a household that had weathered its first full season together and found itself, on the whole, well suited to one another. Eleanor sat among them with a cup of the spiced wine warming her hands, listening more than talking, and found herself, as the old year turned quietly toward the new, somewhere in the dark beyond the shuttered windows, thinking not of resolutions in the ordinary sense, but of the single steady intention she had already, in practice, been keeping since that lamplit November evening in the still-room, to tend what had been left in her care with exactly the patience and exactly the quiet faithfulness it had always received, and to go on tending it, season after season, for as long as the house and its keeping remained hers. The season passed, as such seasons do, in a warm blur of activity that left in its wake, once the family's guests had departed and the new year had been quietly seen, in a particular kind of contented exhaustion that Eleanor recognized, dimly, as the same exhaustion Mrs. Pruitt's careful ledgers had recorded, year after year, in the brief, terse January entries that followed each Christmas season's more elaborate December accounting. Coal consumed, provisions replenished, linen sent for washing in greater quantity than any other fortnight of the year, the plain, practical aftermath of a house that had been asked, for a fortnight, to show its very best face to the world, and had done so successfully, and now required, in its turn, a period of quiet recovery before the whole long cycle of the working year properly resumed. On a clear, very cold evening in the first quiet week of the new year. With the snow lying deep and unbroken across the parkland and the whole house settled into the particular hush that heavy snow brings to old buildings, muffling every sound from outside to something distant and soft, Eleanor went to the still room, as she often did now, in the quiet hour after supper, and lit the single lamp and sat for a while at the work table with the small ivory portrait set before her in its accustomed spot, and found herself speaking aloud, quietly, into the lamplit silence of the room, words she had not planned and could not afterward have entirely reconstructed, a kind of gentle, private accounting of the season's small progress, the row mulched and waiting for spring, the book of receipts a little fuller than it had been in June, the jar on the topmost shelf still standing, unlabeled, exactly where it had always stood, and she found, doing this, that the speaking felt neither strange nor foolish but simply right, a continuation, in her own quiet way, of the daily, careful attention that this small room had received for 36 unbroken years before her arrival, and would, she was now entirely resolved, continue to receive for as many years as the position remained hers to hold, she thought, sitting there in the lamplight with the snow lying deep and silent beyond the single window, of the spring still some months distant, when the frost would finally lift and the walled garden would begin, bed by bed, to stir back into life, and the narrow western row would need its first careful weeding of the new year, her own hands doing the work now, her own knees in her own apron, learning through the doing exactly what Fenner had promised to show her, and whatever else the plants themselves would teach a patient and attentive keeper across a full turning season. She thought of the coming summer, months further off still, but already, in her mind, taking a clear and settled shape, the lavender in full bloom along the walled garden's southern beds, the narrow western row flowering too, in its own quieter fashion, and herself standing among the rows in the warm July light, gathering the harvest as it had always been gathered, some for the kitchen and the household's ordinary use, and a portion carefully set aside for a single jar that would go, unlabeled still, to the very end of the topmost shelf, taking its place beside its predecessors. One more year added to a devotion that had already outlasted, by a considerable margin, the single working life that had first begun it. She banked the fire that night with a particular carefulness, and locked the still-room door behind her, and climbed the narrow stair to her own room, where the jars on the little shelf caught the last of the firelight, and the wing chair waited in its long, familiar shape. And she sat there for a while, as she often did now before sleep, simply resting in the quiet, settled comfort of a house she had come, across a single autumn, to properly know and to properly belong to. And she thought, before sleep finally came for her, of the whole slow unfolding shape of the year still ahead, the winter's remaining weeks, the spring's first stirring, the summer's full return of color and scent and warmth to the walled garden's careful beds. And she understood that she would meet each season, as it came, in exactly the manner Mrs. Pruitt had met 36 of them before her, with patience, and with careful daily attention, and with a quiet, private faithfulness to the small particular things that make a house, in the end, considerably more than the sum of its rooms and its ledgers and its ordinary practical business. On a still, pale Sunday toward the end of January, with a thin sun doing what little it could against the general grey of the season, Eleanor walked, on her single free half-day, the mile and a half of frozen lane between the hall and the small parish church that served the estate and the scattered cottages around it. A walk she had taken twice before since her arrival, for the ordinary Sunday service, without ever once venturing into the churchyard itself beyond the path to the porch. This time she turned aside, at the low lich gate, and walked instead among the modest ranks of headstones, most old and softened at their edges by long weathering, a few newer and still sharp-cut, until she found, in a quiet corner near the churchyard's eastern wall, a plain grey stone bearing the simple inscription Margaret Pruitt, housekeeper of this parish 36 years, and beneath it, in smaller lettering, the dates of a life that had run, Eleanor calculated standing there in the cold, to just short of 62 years. She stood before the stone for a long while, her breath showing pale in the still January air, and found herself, after a moment, drawing from her coat pocket a small sprig of the dried lavender she had carried with her from the jar nearest the still-room door, not from any particular plan formed in advance, but from an impulse that had come to her only as she left the house that morning. And she knelt, carefully, on the cold, frosted grass, and set the sprig against the base of the stone, and stayed there a while longer in the silence, the churchyard entirely empty around her, but for a pair of rooks working the bare elms along the wall, and found herself speaking, quietly, much as she had spoken aloud in the lamplit still-room some weeks before. A few plain words about the row mulched and waiting. The receipt book continued, the small key found, and the drawer no longer locked. And about Matthew, whose name she said aloud for what she suspected might well have been the first time it had been spoken in that particular churchyard in 40 years, and whose portrait, she told the quiet grey stone, she had taken to setting out in the lamplight now and then, of an evening, so that he should not go entirely unremembered either, whatever distance still lay, and always would lie, between his own resting place, wherever it was, and hers. She walked back to the hall as the thin sun began its early winter descent toward the western hills, the frozen lane crunching underfoot, her hands tucked deep into her coat pockets against the cold, and found, walking, that the visit had settled something in her that she had not entirely realized wanted settling, a sense of the whole story, letters and jar and locked drawer and narrow tended row, having been properly closed, or not closed exactly, she thought, turning the word over as she walked, but properly joined, her own quiet keeping of it now formally linked to the woman who had kept it before her, in a manner that felt, to Eleanor, considerably more complete than the simple private ritual of the lamplit still-room alone had managed to achieve. She mentioned the visit to no one, not even Mrs. Doyle, understanding by now, with a fuller instinct than she had possessed in October, exactly which parts of this particular inheritance were meant to be shared and which were meant to be carried quietly, in the manner of the woman who had first taught her, without ever intending to teach her anything at all. Precisely that distinction. She returned to her ordinary Sunday duties that evening with the particular light, settled feeling of someone who has completed a piece of necessary and long overdue business, and went to bed early, and slept without dreaming, and woke the next morning to the ordinary, welcome business of a house beginning, once more, to stir. The winter wore on, as winters do, in its own patient fashion, the snow giving way eventually to a long, grey, rain-soaked February that Eleanor came to think of, by its end, as the season's true test, harder in its way than the sharper cold of December, a month of low skies and short tempers, and the particular below-stairs weariness that comes from a great many weeks spent largely indoors. And she found herself grateful, more than once, for the small, steady comforts the still room continued to offer her. An hour by the lamp with the ledger and the receipt book, the row of jars on the shelf, the small ivory portrait she still, from time to time, set out on the work table for the length of a quiet evening before returning it. Always to its place in the unlocked drawer beneath. March arrived with a sudden, generous mildness that seemed to catch the whole estate slightly by surprise. The first snowdrops already finished and gone in the sheltered corners of the walled garden, crocuses pushing up in bright purple and gold clusters along the borders, and Fenner came to find her on a bright, blustery morning in the second week of the month, exactly as he had promised in December, to show her, at last, the particular way Mrs. Pruitt had kept the narrow western row, the careful early clearing of the winter's protective mulch, the light, patient turning of the soil around each individual plant's base, done by hand rather than with any tool, the small attentions to drainage and to the removal of anything that might crowd or shade the young growth as it began, tentatively, to show itself along the base of each gray-green stem. Eleanor knelt in the cool March soil in her own apron, exactly as she had promised Fenner and herself she would, and worked through the row plant by plant under his brief, occasional guidance, and found the labor itself, the particular quality of attention it demanded, small and repetitive, and entirely absorbing, settling into her in a way that felt less like the learning of a new practical skill and more like the slow, physical completion of something she had begun in a very different manner. That lamplit evening in the still room the previous autumn, she thought, working along the row with her knees damp through her apron, and the bright March wind moving overhead through the walled garden's bare fruit trees, of the young man in the small oval portrait, dead now these 4 decades, and of the young woman he had written to so carefully and so hopefully across those 18 long-past months. And she understood, kneeling there in the cool spring soil, that this particular labor, plant by plant, season by season, was itself a kind of continuing correspondence, carried on now by hands that had never known either of them, but had come, through patience and attention, and the slow accumulation of a single autumn and winter's careful keeping, to understand exactly what was owed, and exactly how it ought properly to be given. "You've a good hand for it," Fenner said, watching her work, in the brief, plain manner of a man not given to lengthy compliments. "She'd not have found fault with your keeping of it, Miss Hartley, and that's saying a good deal, coming from what I remember of her standards." "I hope not," Eleanor said, sitting back on her heels and looking down the length of the narrow row, the first small signs of the season's new growth just visible now along its length, and finding, looking at it, a quiet, settled satisfaction, considerably deeper than the modest physical achievement of an hour's careful weeding would ordinarily account for. "I should like to think I'm keeping faith with something worth the keeping." She finished the row as the morning drew toward noon, and rose and brushed the soil from her apron, and walked back toward the house, past the great sweeping beds of the ordinary lavender, cut back hard for the winter, and already, here and there, showing the faint gray-green fuzz of new growth along their woody bases, and thought of the summer still some months ahead, the whole garden in full flower, the bees returned to their patient, accumulated hum among the rows, and a single jar, filled once more from the narrow western bed's modest harvest, taking its unlabeled place at the end of the topmost shelf. One more year added to a devotion that showed, Eleanor reflected, climbing the stone steps to the kitchen door with the bright March light falling across the whole awakening garden behind her, no sign whatsoever of being anywhere near its natural end. Outside, the light lay long and gold across the whole awakening sweep of the parkland. The old oaks just beginning to show the faint green haze of new leaf at their crowns, the walled garden's beds stirring row by row out of their winter stillness, the narrow western row foremost, among them now, tended and known and entirely, unmistakably alive. Somewhere below, the house held its familiar accumulated warmth against the last cool edge of the spring evening. Doors locked, the great ring of keys hanging quiet on its hook beside the still-room door. The small brass key returned once more to its rosewood box. Its work, for this season at least, contentedly done. And in the small room at the corridor's end, in the bed that had once been another woman's bed, beneath a quilt folded by another woman's hands, Eleanor Hartley slept, deeply and peacefully, keeper now, in her own right and in her own settled time, of every quiet room and every careful secret that Millbrook Hall had, across one long autumn and winter and the first turning of a new spring, entrusted to her keeping. Sleep well.